Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Sean Harris Oliver's play, The Fighting Season. So this is, I think, a very important piece of contemporary drama. Not necessarily one I'm a huge fan of. It's about it's sort of set up as kind of the memoirs of these three members of the Canadian Forces Health Services Group who served at Kandahar Airfield Base in Afghanistan. So it's an important play, obviously, because it's topical. I mean, especially given the ongoing conflict in the Middle East and the role of UN forces, Canadian forces, and especially US forces in my own country involved in conflicts in the Middle East. It's also it's a significant exploration of different types of PTSD, different ways of trying to make sense of the experience of being in the military, being in combat surgery, things like this. And part of where Oliver gets the inspiration for this play is actually his father's service in the Canadian Medical Forces. And so it's a play in part inspired by his father John Oliver's service there. But the play follows three characters. Terry, who is an orthopedic surgeon in his 50s to early 60s, Corinne, who's an ICU nurse in her 20s to early 30s, and Christy, who's a medic in his 30s to early 40s. This is largely focused on the period after they return to Canada and as they're attempting to return to a normal life, as they're attempting to figure out a way of transitioning from the combat zone, medical treatment in a war zone, back into civilian life in Canada. And each of them has their own distinct perspectives and their own distinct problems. Christy is probably the most overtly traumatized character. So at one point, he says, "One of the craziest things about getting back was getting used to the quiet. Got back to Canada and I realized I'd forgotten the sound of birds chirping." Can you imagine that? Forgetting the sound of birds? Then the other bit that I think is really significant with Terry, he gives us the most overt sort of description of, or he gives us one of the most overt descriptions of PTSD. We get one from Terry later on, but he doesn't necessarily seem to recognize it as PTSD. But Christy says, "Being back, man, being a civilian, it's like one moment life is good, everything's normal, calm, then screeching tires, ambulance siren, or a helicopter, and I get hit with a tidal wave from nowhere. I think I've locked everything up, buried it away, and then I'm right back over there." And he pulls out a vial of Oxycontin. This is what you have to look forward to after 3 months, or after 3 deployments. So for Christy, he's very sort of overt about the traumatic experience that he's gone through, and he's very overt about his reliance on drugs to try and get through it. But one of the things that's really interesting about Christie is that toward the end of the play, he raises this issue that in Canada he doesn't know who he is, but in Afghanistan he knew who he was. And so he actually ends the play asking to be sent back to Afghanistan, back into medical combat service in order to sort of recover that sense of identity. Terry is also pretty traumatized. Terry, the older surgeon, he starts out not particularly interested. So a lot of this play, and actually this is the thing that I'm not a huge fan of, a lot of this play is basically monologues. We have 3 intertwined monologues, and I just don't care for monologue plays. It's not a technique I particularly enjoy, either reading or watching. So for me, there's that issue. But for people who like monologue plays, it's not a problem. But basically, these characters are all sort of talking to therapists, something like this. Karine, I think, is speaking to a recording device, a tape recorder, something like this. But they're all sort of talking to someone. So Terry starts out not particularly interested in talking about this stuff for his own sake. What he says basically at the beginning of his portion is that his wife Barbara is more or less forcing him to talk to someone, and so we get that sense of like he's an older guy. He's from a generation, and he says this later on. I can't remember where he says it exactly, but at some point he's talking about how his father didn't discuss emotions and how he's inherited that approach. Again, this very traditional sort of Western masculinity, especially I think in the U.S. and Canada, with our sort of frontier heritage and traditions of rugged individualism and things like this. But the stories Terry tells reveal the effects of trauma on him, even though he seems less, unlike Christie, he seems pretty unwilling to accept that he's been traumatized. So like at one point he tells this story about being in a liquor store, and Don Cherry, who I think every Canadian knows Don Cherry. A lot of Americans probably don't, but Don Cherry, major figure in hockey for a long time. He's recently, I think, lost a lot of his prestige but I'll put that aside. So, but Don Cherry for a long, long time, decades, was like the god of hockey. And so one of the things that Don Cherry did was he was a very overt and vocal supporter of the Canadian Armed Forces during the Afghanistan and Iraq Wars. And so so Terry is in a liquor store, and this young French-Canadian guy and his girlfriend or his friend or whatever it is are there, and this French-Canadian says something disrespectful about Don Cherry while he's showing pictures of Canadians who have died in Afghanistan. And Terry has to restrain himself from physically attacking this kid. And so he has this sort of extended rant about how good people have it in Canada and how they don't respect the work that they've done. They don't respect the sacrifices that people have made and all of this stuff. And we get this again later on. He's leaving his country club, and a woman is talking about how the war was fought for oil, and he basically starts screaming at this woman in this country club and has to actually be escorted out. So we get this sense of like, he is this traumatized figure, but because he's got that socialization into a particular brand of masculinity, stoic masculinity, he can't really come to terms with that trauma. Now, Corinne is the third figure. She seems to be the most balanced. There are some sort of religious concerns she has, some ethical concerns she has, but she seems to be the most grounded and the most stable of the three characters until virtually the very end of the play. Spoiler alert, I guess, if you're planning to read this or watch this play at some point. But what we sort of get over the course of the play through these few episodes where the characters are all interacting is that they shared this experience where a young Afghan man was brought in, and he had his abdomen cut open and a grenade put inside with a detonator that he was holding. And they took him into surgery to try and save. They took him in without doing the safety checks they were normally supposed to do, because he was very close to dying. So he essentially attempted to use his own body as a booby trap. He doesn't manage to set off the grenade, and they do manage to save his life. But Corinne has this bit at the end of the play where she talks about walking back to the wing of the hospital where the Afghans, both combatants and civilians, are held, I guess, the wing where they're convalescing, and pulling all of the cords from the machines keeping him alive. And she says, she goes through this list of things that she's denying. She says part of this in French, but I'll do it in English because I don't speak French. All the cords I pull, no more connection, no more oxygen, no more blood, no more circulation. I stop everything, all the machines. I'm the attending nurse. No one will come. I'm the judgment. I will not save him. No one will save him. No one. I close the door, turn the latch tight. So, I mean, this most stable character, we learn in the last, almost the last moments of the play, has committed this terrible act of murdering a patient who was under her care out of these conflicting experiences of having saved a person who was trying to kill them. So this, like, in a way, it's a brilliant thing to put at the end of the play because it shifts our whole perspective on Kareem. But there's one more thing I do just quickly want to tell you about this play, because we do get some very brief but biting political critiques as well. So like at one point, Christie is talking. He's talking about the Francis Ford Coppola film Apocalypse Now, and how that sort of softened people's perspective on the horrors of Vietnam. And he's talking about forgetting, and he has this transition. He says, but I don't forget. Like, you remember how we made a big show of telling everyone that we don't use torture tactics over there? Yeah, well, if we took one of them prisoner, you know what happened? We fucking patched them up and hand them over to the Afghan National Army. How the hell you think the goddamn ANA got people talking? Please, we knew what was going on. We just chose not to stop it. Fuck. So again, we've got, they're usually in passing and usually coming from Christie, but we've got these really pithy critiques of the way that the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have been prosecuted, and the political critiques of these wars alongside, for instance, Terry's arguments about Canadian patriotism and the grand history of Canadian military medical service. There's a deep tension in the play about that, because the pride that Terry and even Corinne and Christie have about their medical service, in a way it requires that they ignore that, especially for Terry, it requires that they ignore that they were part of an invading army occupying someone else's country.